So long before the term cancel culture existed, I remember sitting in an open mic night gathering during my undergraduate years. A young woman I knew at the time, whose name I've since forgotten, got up to read a piece about a jazz musician whose name I've since forgotten, published in a magazine whose name I've since forgotten. But I have not forgotten the central question of that piece. For this musician who had made such beautiful music had been an abuser of his wives. And the central question the piece asked over and over was not whether we should cancel this man and his music out of existence, but rather, whose music did we want to let in during our most intimate moments? And for that matter, whose ideas, whose art, whose voice did we want to invite into the intimacy of our hearts and minds? This man, like so many other great artists, had made beautiful music, and like so many other artists, he was a deeply flawed, even abusive human. The central question of this piece was never answered by the author, but rather left for us to ponder. Who do we want to let into the most intimate spaces of our hearts and minds? I appreciate the nuance of this question. Obviously, I've been ruminating about this for decades here, for there are no easy answers. Human beings are complicated, and our relationships, even the ones we have with people and ideas in the public sphere, are complicated. For instance, Carol B. Duncan is a woman who spent time worshiping with the Black Caribbean immigrant women at the Spiritual Baptist Church in Toronto, Canada. Now, most of these women were domestic workers. Duncan writes, of these women, several had stories to tell of coworkers and supervisors who expected them to be all nurturing, servile, caring, and non-complaining under the most arduous and poorly paid of work situations. What brought the writer's attention to these women in this Baptist worship was one particular item found on the altar in the back left corner, with a statue of a Black woman in headdress and skirts like the women of the church wore. It was a statue of Aunt Jemima. So I want to leave you with that image for just a moment. This one jarring note in a place of reverent worship, this Aunt Jemima figurine. And we'll come back to that because Aunt Jemima, of course, is one of the things, and you've probably heard this in the news lately or on social media, one of the things that some people claim has become a victim of so-called cancel culture, as this 130-year-old pancake mix brand changes to a new name because Aunt Jemima represents a particular stereotype, the idea of the mammy, a stereotype seen in movies like Gone with the Wind, and like the Caribbean women of that Baptist church, a stereotype that's expected to be all nurturing, servile, caring, non-complaining. For 130 years, Aunt Jemima has stared out at us all from the packaging of these products, never a real person, though Black women have been hired to play her throughout the years, and none of them reap the financial rewards that the company did. So when it was noted that the company had finally decided that this marketing was outdated and racist, there was an outcry that Aunt Jemima was being canceled. And we've heard similar outcries about Dr. Seuss being supposedly canceled because a few of his books are no longer being reprinted because of racist content, or certain talk show hosts or politicians or celebrities because of the things they've done or said, canceled. It's a big word right now. Demetria Slight is quoted in the current edition of Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and I don't usually quote from the dictionary, but this is a new entry, cancel culture. And she says, cancel culture refers to the mass withdrawal of support from public figures or celebrities who have done things that aren't socially acceptable today. This practice of canceling or mass shaming often occurs on social media platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. So at best, this sounds like good sense, and at worst, it sounds like mob mentality. And as as our music director mentioned before. Some have called it things like the Salem witch trial. So where's the truth in between all of this? So Black writer Danielle Butler writes, similar to its predecessor PC culture, which is used to bemoan the mythical tyranny of political correctness, cancel culture has become a popular catch-all to describe a social justice warrior agenda that some believe goes too far when challenging the status quo, saying that it threatens free speech and discourse. Butler challenges the notion that there is a culture at all. There is no unified internet mob making decisions on who or what is to be canceled because of something they have said or done, or in the case of Aunt Jemima or the Dr. Seuss books, the perpetuation of racist ideas. Instead, Butler notes that with social media, there are groups of people who have a relatively new platform to express these very human behaviors and be heard, imperfect as some of these expressions may be. However, what people do when they invoke dog whistles like cancel culture is illustrate their discomfort with the kinds of people who now have a voice and their audacity to direct it towards figures with more visibility and power. So I think of those immigrant Caribbean women in this Canadian church who have placed Aunt Jemima, this racist symbol of being servile, in a place of honor. Carol B. Duncan says that in this complicated relationship with a problematic iconic figure, these women are reclaiming the image of a mother figure. They're valuing and cherishing it in the sanctuary where it is not, and they are not, cherished out in a world that instead exploits them. Dressed in head wrap and long skirts, just like the women in this church, this garb is understood by these women as symbolic of their spiritual gifts. Some might argue that removing Aunt Jemima from the marketplace also removes the possibility of this kind of meaningful relationship. That's the danger of cancellation, one could say, that it removes ideas and possibilities from the public sphere. But is that really a significant concern? Certainly in the last year and a half, we've seen a tendency toward hyperbole and hysteria heighten online and in the media. And while I want to in no way suggest that there are equal sides in the discourse all the time, sometimes there are things that are just right and sometimes there are things that are wrong, but I do recognize that a traumatized nation with poor modeling in civil public discourse will struggle to not overcorrect at times. Barack Obama said, if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or use the wrong verb, I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself. See how woke I was. I called you out. That's not activism. That's not about change. If all you're doing is casting stones, you're probably not going to get that far. Effective change needs opening for solutions, along with the important work of naming what's wrong, calling something out. And some of the best ways to affect change are when a person or organization has space for self-reflection. I appreciated in the New York Times recently there was an op-ed piece from Alexis McKill Johnson, president of Planned Parenthood. And she writes, we're done making excuses for our founder. We must reckon with Margaret Sanger's association with white supremacist groups and eugenics, but we can't simply call her racist, scrub her from our history, and move on. We must examine how we have perpetuated her harms over the last century as an organization, an institution, and as individuals. In other words, Johnson still believes in the work of Planned Parenthood. She's not canceling that. And she's also being honest about their founder's significant shortcomings. And she's not canceling that story. She's accepting the consequences of that truth. It stays part of the Planned Parenthood story, neither sugar-coated nor erased. And that is really my takeaway from this idea of cancel culture. At its best, it's not actually a culture of cancellation at all. It's actually a culture of consequence. It's about people or institutions or businesses being accountable for harmful deeds they have done, harmful ideas that they perpetuate. But the question becomes then, aren't we, when we make changes in who or what gets a public forum, doing away with things that have been important culturally and historically? What about those immigrant women who Aunt Jemima means so much to? Here's the thing. A business changing its name and marketing image, as in the case of Aunt Jemima, is not canceling an idea. It's not erasing it from existence. If this image has meant something to these immigrant women in a Toronto church, it's still there for them. But it's important to note that they had already subverted this image. What made Aunt Jemima sacred for them was that they were humanizing her because of their own experiences as similarly dressed women of color in domestic service. They knew what kind of hardships the fictional Jemima would have endured. They knew where she was seen as a person and where she was exploited. Their decision to make this figure into a sacred symbol is one that they can continue to use or not long after the company that exploits her face has moved on to another marketing approach. Just like Dr. Seuss books that are no longer published, or I don't know, comedians who lose high profile gigs, these books or people are still out there for those who seek them out. For as our reading today made the distinction, we're not talking about government censoring. We're talking about individuals and organizations deciding, often based on public discourse, what is or is not worth publishing, promoting, or giving a platform to. Like Planned Parenthood, there can be reckoning with an organization's or person's past. There can be accountability, and the good parts can still live on. Gone with the Wind was not erased from our TV screens because of its racist depictions, despite what articles I saw a few months ago about that. Instead, it was still shown on television recently, but this time with a spoken introduction that put it in historical context and named the areas of concern. A culture of consequence invites us to do things thoughtfully, to consider what we often take for granted, store brands, movies, books, celebrities, politicians, and ask ourselves if we could do better. Now, the danger, of course, is that we can start to become addicted to outrage. We can become hypervigilant to the next thing or person that needs to be held accountable. We can lack compassion in our judgment. Our fast-paced internet world makes this easy, as does the depth to which public discourse has sunk. Add in the stresses of this past year, and it's a recipe for people to be reactive rather than reflective. And like the Aunt Jemima story illustrates, it is important to remember that people have complicated relationships to figures and ideas in the public sphere. It can be tough to reconcile that a beloved music maker or writer or sports hero or TV reality or sitcom star, sometimes people who have broken barriers for marginalized communities, can also be someone who is a domestic abuser, rapist, sexual harasser, or harmer of children. It's easy to get defensive and see the reckoning of truth as an attempt to sweep away all meaning something might have given to one's life. I think that's one of the things, along with old-fashioned racism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. But I do think that's one of the things I hear at the heart of people who decry so-called cancel culture, this fear of erasure. That when something they connected with, however casually or however profoundly, is in danger of going away, their deepest fears of being unvalued or erased surface. None of us have lived a life without wrongdoing at some point, and sometimes seeing the court of public opinion move so swiftly can be a little scary. Ultimately, though, the use of the term cancel culture is one I don't hold with as a Unitarian Universalist. It seems like it diminishes the thoughtful reflections of so many traditionally marginalized folks who are having an opportunity to add their voices to conversations about consequences, often long overdue consequences. Our UU tradition also invites us to hold compassion for the mistakes human beings make along the way, and that the voices we add to the conversation are ones that speak words of accountability with some measure of kindness. It's not an easy balance to find. The one, the balance that holds both compassion rather than constant outrage and consequence in our arms with the strength and gentleness that we hold a new baby with. The truth is that there is nothing that is ever really canceled in the sense that the current term is often used. It's still up to individuals to decide if they want to engage with a person's art, if they want to still read their books or watch their movies or listen to their podcasts. These things aren't scrubbed from existence, and that I would certainly take issue with, but instead are being taken down from some of the rarefied positions they might have held in our culture, like those Confederate statues that no longer belong in the town square in front of the courthouse, but are fittingly being housed in museums. And really, it's about time. No one is owed a paid platform for their voice, and when our words and actions don't respect the platforms we have been given, when they cause harm, then those platforms should be in danger of being taken away. We still, each and every one of us, have freedom of speech, but having the right to have your own network TV show is a different thing altogether. You know, in the end, I'm grateful for these public critiques we are witnessing, this way of raising our voice about what's unjust. And I'm grateful once I get past some of the hype that often surrounds them. I'm grateful for the insights. I'm even grateful, even when it's fatiguing, of having to rethink my understanding or relationship to a well-known book or movie or even person. And in the end, I recognize that this rethinking doesn't make me lose anything. I only gain something along the way. I gain insight. I gain wisdom. I gain compassion. In this sense, rather than being a culture of cancellation, a truly functional culture of consequence can ultimately work to fuel a culture of connection.